Looking at the political situation in German-speaking countries in the mid-19th century, there was not only the problem of German unification, but also the question of who should take over the leadership of the German tribes in the future. It was Otto von Bismarck who paved the way for the founding of the German Empire without an all-encompassing language barrier by first solving three difficult tasks. In 1864, the Danish question was resolved, in 1866, the Austro-German question, and in 1871, the Franco-German question. The period that our historiography refers to as the Wars of Unification. However, the completely different alliances during the three wars of liberation also showed how complicated the situation in Germany was in the second third of the 19th century. Because in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, much to the surprise of Paris, the German tribes were united as brothers, but just 4 years earlier, they were still fighting against Prussia in the German War of 1866. Troop contingents of the German Confederation, alongside the Empire of Austria, also included those of the kingdoms of Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, and other German duchies. On the Prussian side, alongside troops mainly from the Kingdom of Italy, there were a number of German duchies and free cities. But 2 years earlier, in 1864, when the war against Denmark was fought, Prussia and Austria stood united as the entire German national movement against the Danish encroachments on the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. These areas of German origin and German ethnicity had been in personal union with Denmark since the year 1460, but possessed the old, documented right, quote, to remain undivided in perpetuity, in other words, to retain their political independence. However, although this peaceful coexistence had functioned more or less well for around 400 years, in the 19th century, with its national aspirations, resistance to Danish rule also arose in the Elbe duchies. Because Holstein was an almost exclusively German-populated territory, and only in the north of Schleswig was there a Danish minority. But when, during the German Revolution of 1848, the German population demanded the granting of a Schleswig-Holstein constitution, its own parliament, and admission to the German Confederation, Denmark under King Frederick VII took advantage of the foreign policy weakness brought about by the revolution and announced the incorporation of Schleswig into its country, thus creating a state expanded to the south and with the Ida River as the national border. This was the cause of the Schleswig-Holstein-Danish War, which lasted from April 9, 1848 to May 8, 1851, that is, 3 years, between the German duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, which were striving for independence from Denmark in alliance with the German Confederation and the Kingdom of Denmark. The picture shows the flight of the Danes from Flensburg on the second day of Easter in 1848. However, when Schleswig-Holstein troops entered Denmark in May, supported by Prussian forces and Field Marshal Friedrich Graf von Wrangel, the intervening countries of Great Britain, France, and Russia forced Prussia and Denmark to sign the Armistice of Malmö on the 26th of August, 1848. However, this treaty was perceived by many in Germany as Prussian high-handedness, which even led to violent unrest. But when Denmark renounced the treaty on the 22nd of February, 1849, war broke out again, mainly involving the Prussian troops stationed there to protect the territory. And once again, under pressure from Russia and through British and Swedish mediation, Prussia had to first agree to a ceasefire on July 10, 1850, and then, on behalf of the German Confederation, conclude a separate peace with Denmark in the Peace of Berlin, including the withdrawal of its soldiers. Now that the federal war against Denmark had ended, the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein were left on their own and tried to reach an agreement with Denmark on their own. But without success. But in the Battle of Idstedt on the 24th and 25th of July, 1850, their army suffered defeat, which temporarily sealed the hopes of the people of Schleswig and Holstein for independence from Danish rule. The Danish victory meant that the Duchy of Schleswig, and with it the city of Flensburg, remained part of the Kingdom of Denmark in a personal union, administered by the extraordinary Danish government commissioner, Fritz Tillich. Holstein was occupied by Prussian and Austrian federal troops. The Schleswig-Holstein army was disbanded on April 1, 1851. As a memento, every veteran received this cross on a ribbon. In order to show the world the triumph of their victory over Schleswig-Holstein and to remind the losers of it every day, on the 25th of July, 1862, the 12th anniversary of the Battle of Idstedt, the Danes erected a 72-meter-high victory monument in the shape of a mammoth lion in the old cemetery in Flensburg, destroying 200 German coffins and crypts, and throwing the bones found there into a pit. And to ensure that the Idstedt lion was not disturbed by the memorial plaques of the German soldiers buried there, the Danish stonemason Kleving smashed all the plaques. When the German-Danish War began in 1864, citizens of Flensburg tried to tear down the monument, which they saw as a symbol of foreign rule and oppression, but only the lion's tail was damaged. After the German victory, Otto von Bismarck had the lion, which was only called the tree frog in Germany due to its unfavorable shape, brought to Berlin as legitimate spoils of war, where it was erected in the armory on February 9, 1868. Later, it was placed in the Royal Prussian Main Guard barracks in Berlin-Lichterfelde. A copy from the year 1938 is still located today in the Berlin district of Wannsee on the lakeshore at Heckelshorn, along with an explanatory plaque. When the Danish government wanted the original Flensburg lion back after the Second World War, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had it brought from Berlin to Copenhagen in the autumn of 1945. Then, 66 years later, in the year 2011, the sycophantic politics of the city of Flensburg ensured that the Danes were able to erect their lion, once intended as a monument of provocation and rightly called a monstrous abomination by Flensburg councillor Hans Wilhelm Preece, in the old cemetery in Flensburg under a Christian Democratic Union mayor and against the will of a large number of Flensburg residents. However, it is hardly to be feared that Germany will now demand in return that those who senselessly destroyed German monuments in the weeks after the Second World War rebuild them in their old places. This would concern the Düppel monument, which was blown up on May 13, 1945, and which also commemorated the famous pioneer Klinke, of whom only the head could be saved. The monument near Ankiel on Als, or the Bismarck Tower on Nievesburg in Aubenraa, which was blown up on August 16, 1945, just to name a few. Back to the prelude of the war in 1864. After the defeat at Idstedt, Denmark went all the way, and in October 1853, against the opposition of the Schleswig Estates, made Schleswig, quote, an inseparable part of the Danish kingdom, and Holstein an independent part of the Danish monarchy. From June 1854, the Army and Navy, Customs, Postal Service, and currency were Danish. In addition, most German clergy and teachers in North Schleswig were replaced by Danes. German communities were forced to use Danish as the language of church and school. Numerous German civil servants and professors from Kiel were expelled from the country, and German-born officers and crew members who had been exonerated were denied their pensions. All of this reached its peak in 1863, when the Danish King Frederick VII introduced a new constitution, with which German Schleswig was to be annexed by Denmark once again. When he died unexpectedly on November 15th, his successor Christian IX signed the law despite his reservations. However, the Danish nationalists seem to have forgotten that their high-handed approach had provoked sharp protests from all the states united in the German Confederation on several occasions since 1855. With his signature, Christian IX of Denmark had finally pushed things too far. On the 1st of October, 1863, the German Confederation declared the so-called November Constitution invalid and threatened federal execution against Holstein and Lauenburg. The image shows the border of the German Confederation in red, Prussia in blue, other states in gray, and Austria in yellow. Federal execution could always be applied if a member state violated the obligations of the federal constitution and included the military occupation of the affected state territory and the takeover of governmental power there. In this case, the federal execution was formally directed against the Duchy of Holstein, but in reality against Denmark. However, the latter had also been granted a 9-week period of reflection. However, confident that Great Britain and Sweden would provide support if necessary, the Danish Parliament adopted the Constitution on November 13, 1863, which was de facto equivalent to a declaration of war against the German Confederation. As a result, on the 14th of January, 1864, Austria and Prussia decided to pursue their policy towards Denmark without regard for the decisions of the Bundestag sitting in the Thurn und Taxis Palace in Frankfurt. 2 days later, on the 16th of January, they gave Denmark a final 2-day ultimatum to repeal the November Constitution and evacuate Schleswig, but Denmark again allowed the deadline to pass. This led to the federal execution being ordered, with Austria, Prussia, Saxony, and Hanover responsible for carrying out the military solution. At first, it looked as if the mutual military agreement between Berlin and Vienna, i.e., the campaign in Schleswig and Jutland, would bring the unification of Germany a good deal closer. However, the internal and external differences were too great to create a basis for a lasting alliance. On the one hand, there was the Protestant, enlightened and tightly controlled Prussian military monarchy of the Hohenzollerns, which was striving for reform and resembled a lion. On the other hand, there was the antiquated and cumbersome multi-ethnic empire of the Catholic Habsburgs in Austria. And while a conquered Schleswig was of little value to Austria, which was located far to the south, it was very much in Prussia's interest as a German great power competing with the Habsburgs to annex this area with its eminent importance as a border region. At that time, still largely unknown, and on September 18, 1858, appointed as chief of the Prussian General Staff, Major General Helmut von Moltke, later known as the Elder, had already addressed possible operations against Denmark in a memorandum dated December 6, 1862, and had presented a detailed operational plan. On the 20th of January, 1864, the already 80-year-old Field Marshal Freie, Friedrich von Wrangel, was given supreme command of the Allied troops. Prussia provided around 35,000 men with 110 guns, Austria 22,000 with 48 guns. After Wrangel was raised to the rank of Count, he was replaced on May 18, 1864, by General of Cavalry Prince Friedrich Karl von Preußen. The Austrian Sixth Army Corps was commanded by Field Marshal Lieutenant Ludwig von Gavlenz. All artillery at Düppel was under the command of Prussian General Gustav Eduard Hintersin, who was replaced by Hintersin a year later. To distinguish between them, the Prussian and Austrian soldiers wore white armbands, but also in memory of their joint struggle in the wars of liberation against Napoleon. After the campaign against Denmark began on February 1st, 1864, only a few days later, on February 5th, the Danish commander-in-chief, Lieutenant General Christian Julius de Mesa, first abandoned the fortified Darneberg, which he had occupied in January and which is located in northern Schleswig-Holstein today, leaving behind almost all of his artillery and retreated further inland. Mesa had been forced to resign and was replaced first by Lieutenant General Matthias von Lutechow, then by Lieutenant General von Gerlach. During their retreat, the Danes suffered significant losses due to the pursuing Austrian units, especially on February 6th in the Battle of Oversee. After that, the Austrians prepared to advance through Flensburg to conquer Jutland. In contrast, the Prussian troops advancing east of the Austrians were less successful in their operations and were even repelled on February 2nd in the Battle of Missunda. However, after General Gerlach had cleared the Darneberg, including Missunda, the Prussian regiments encountered strong resistance at the Düppel Redoubts, where most of the Danish forces had retreated. The Düppel redoublements were a fortification on the Baltic Sea near the village of Düppel, opposite Sonderburg, between the Flensburg Fjord and Alsesund. They protected the bridgehead of Sonderburg, which lay in front of the fortified island of Alsen. 10 forts blocked access from the land side, using a chain of hills about 4 kilometers long. Since it was impossible for the Prussian troops that had arrived at the ramparts to defeat the Danish regiments gathered there in open battle, a formal siege began, accompanied by heavy shelling of the ramparts with artillery and mortars. They all looked like that afterwards. By April 17th, the Prussian companies had worked their way to about 300 to 500 meters from the assault starting position in front of the entrenchments. For the infantry and pioneer attack planned for the next day, 6 assault columns had been formed, consisting of 46 companies from various regiments. They had to be chosen by lot beforehand, as all the troops wanted to take part in the decisive battle. At 4 o'clock in the morning on the 18th, the cannonade began with over 100 guns, until suddenly at 10 o'clock, the firing ceased and an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. What happened next was described by Wilhelm Kamphausen, a German military and battle painter who followed the battle from the so-called Feldherrenhügel. Suddenly, demonically, as if the earth had stored them up, thousands sprang out of the concealing trench over the breastworks, the storm flags were unfurled, and already the whole field, previously so desolate and yellow, was strewn with storming warriors. The attacking storm company had such speed that the older captains were overtaken by their soldiers, and the staff officers were unable to keep up with the first ranks. Then, after a few moments, the front infantrymen, supported by sappers, had overcome the open ground and reached the rampart, where assault ladders and bundles of brushwood, known as fascines, were now being placed. Many soldiers carried sandbags with them to fill the trenches in front of them, or to clear a path across the field-based stakes with sharp iron spikes that had been put up by the Danes. However, the Danish regiments, already decimated by the cannonade, put up a fierce defense. Their defensive fire with grenades, shrapnel, cartridges, and rifle volleys repeatedly tore bloody gaps in the ranks of the attackers. But the onrushing crowd could not be stopped. After just a few minutes, the Prussian soldiers had broken into the redoubt, where a bitter close-quarters battle took place, but the Danes were not able to withstand it. At 10:15, the Prussian black and white victory banners were flying over redoubts 2 through 6. In just a quarter of an hour, the much-vaunted Sevastopol of the north had fallen. Here is the Düppel storm cross. After the rest of the Düppel position had been captured by the Prussians, The remnants of the Danish troops had cleared the mainland and retreated across the sea with 16,000 men and 56 guns to the island of Fyn, and with 10,000 men and 24 guns to Alsen. Of the 119 captured Danish cannons, 20 have been hanging on the lowest drum of the victory column in Berlin since 1873. The naval battle at Heligoland that took place on May 9 between the naval forces of Austria and Prussia under the Austrian Admiral Wilhelm von Tegertau and those of Denmark under Vice Admiral Edward Swensen ended in a tactical Danish victory, but it could no longer change the outcome of the war. After Prussian troops had crossed over to the island of Alsen and conquered it, the Danish king was forced to sign an armistice on the 18th of July, 1864. The German-Danish War ended with the Peace of Vienna on the 30th of October, 1864, in which Denmark had to cede the Duchy of Schleswig, the Duchy of Holstein, and the Duchy of Saxe-Lauenburg to Prussia and Austria. The new border in the north is shown in green. However, just 2 years later, the dispute over Schleswig-Holstein on the surface led to the German Civil War between Austria and Prussia, although in reality, it was about settling the question of whether there would be a small or a large Germany, either under Prussian or Austrian leadership. During the storming of the Düppel Redoubts, an incident occurred that was celebrated in Prussia for decades as an example of self-sacrificing soldiery, even though it did not happen as reported. During the assault on Redoubt No. 2, units of the Prussian infantry regiments No. 35 and 60 were deployed, supported by soldiers of the 4th Company of the 3rd Brandenburg Pioneer Battalion. When the artillery cannonade ended at around 10 o'clock, the infantry was joined by the pioneers, who were loaded with explosives. The German General Staff's official account then described the rest as follows. Unoffizier Lademan from the engineers lit the fuse of the 30-pound bag of powder. Pioneer Kiddo threw the ladder from the glacis against the foot of the palisades. The immediate explosion knocked over 2 palisades. Pioneer Klinke, who was already at the palisade wall, was severely burned and then fatally shot by a bullet as he climbed out of the frame. This gave rise to the legend that Karl Klinke, born on June 15 at 1840 in Boesdorf Vorwerk near Spremberg, was the man who, loaded with a sack of gunpowder and shouting, "I am Klinke, I will open the gate," blew himself up in the explosion of the palisade wall, sacrificing himself for victory. It was also noteworthy that the Association for the Care of Wounded Warriors, founded on January 2nd, 1864 in Oldenburg, became active for the first time, a later member of the German Red Cross. During the war, on the Prussian-Austrian side, 1,275 soldiers were killed, 2,393 were wounded, and 165 were reported missing. Among the fallen was also the Prussian Major General of Infantry, Eduard von Raven, who died on April 27, 1864 in Düppel as a result of wounds he had suffered on April 18th. Denmark mourned 2,933 fallen, 3,159 wounded, and around 7,000 soldiers taken prisoner. While this war is an integral part of national celebrations in Denmark, it has been almost forgotten in Germany. In school textbooks, it is often mentioned in just a few sentences. However, the Danes would also be well advised to realize that this war between two neighbors in the middle of Europe, which left so many dead and maimed, is a day of mourning that should be commemorated with dignity and without much fanfare and exaggerated military pomp. Untitled by Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen, 2020.